Will Russia, Turkiye and China provide support to Iran in its conflict with Israel? The three countries have condemned Israel's actions, but is that enough? And what do they all stand to lose if the conflict spirals out of control? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finigan. It is a conflict that has the potential to ignite the entire Middle East. Israel has been attacking Iran, saying that Tehran's nuclear programme poses an existential threat. Iran, for its part, has responded with a barrage of retaliatory attacks while insisting that its nuclear programme is for peaceful purposes. But now, with the two sides launching missiles and drones at each other, what role can the global community play? China, Russia and Turkey have condemned Israel's actions and called for diplomacy. Beijing and Moscow maintain economic and political ties with both Iran and Israel. So, what, if anything, can these powers do to end the conflict? And is there a shift in dynamics in the region? We'll put that to our guests in just a moment. But first, Imogen Kimber reports.
Israel continues to target Iran. And Iran is returning fire, hitting Tel Aviv and other cities. As the battle intensifies, major global and regional powers, including China, Russia and Turkey, have spoken out against Israel, who initiated the conflict.
Vladimir Putin condemned Israel's military operation against Iran and expressed serious concern about a possible escalation of the conflict, which would have unpredictable consequences for the entire situation in the Middle East.
Russia backed Iran in supporting Syria's former leader Bashar al-Assad, and it sees Iran as a counterbalance to US influence in the Middle East. But Moscow also has ties with Israel. After calling the Iranian and Israeli leaders, Russian President Vladimir Putin spoke to US President Donald Trump. Both agreed that negotiations on Iran's nuclear program should continue. There was also a phone call between the Chinese and Israeli foreign ministers, in which China said Israel violated Iran's sovereignty. China has ties with Israel and Iran. Tehran is part of China's Belt and Road project, and Beijing is one of Israel's biggest trading partners.
The sudden escalation of the regional situation does not serve the interests of any party. The Chinese side calls on relevant parties to take actions that promote regional peace and stability and to avoid further escalation of tensions. The Chinese side is willing to play a constructive role in easing the situation.
Turkey, which is a major critic of Israeli policies, said its actions show a disregard for international law, and that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is dragging the region and the world into disaster. While Russia, Turkey and China have not pledged any military support for Iran so far, their economic and political ties mean they may have a vested interest in trying to maintain the current balance of power. Imogen Kimber, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Ankara, we're joined by Barin Kayaoglu, Chair and Assistant Professor of American Studies at the Social Sciences University of Ankara. From Boston, we're joined by Glenn Carle, Career CIA Officer and Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Transnational Threats from the National Intelligence Council. And from Moscow, we're joined by Nikolai Sukhov, who's Assistant Professor at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Welcome to you all, gentlemen. Nikolai, let's start with you. There's much wringing of hands and condemnation of Israel's attacks on Iran in Moscow, Ankara and Beijing, but all three nations are in a difficult position, aren't they? Particularly Russia, which has good relations with both Israel and Iran. It considers Iran a strategic ally. What might be the Kremlin's thinking right now?
Well, we have a variety of opinions in Moscow right now. Some politicians and policy experts are already warning that the West is changing the equilibrium in the Middle East, the balance in the Middle East, and that this is a Western conspiracy to destroy Russia's main ally in this region. This is one opinion. But more pragmatic people say that we should wait and see. And of course, there is need to support Iran to prevent regime change and major destabilization. But after all, well, Russia's position was always that this war is not Russia's war. And I think this approach is still maintained by the Russian leadership, though, of course, under the current conditions, Russia will do its best to prevent further escalation. By the way, this is our major concern, that due to the hostilities, there might be a spillover that will affect Russian position in the Caspian Sea, and that will affect, of course, the situation in the Gulf. And some people say that in the short run, Russia will win because oil prices will increase. But in the long term, if Iran falls, if it becomes a failed state, or if it survives but has to undergo regime change, that it will be a problem for Russia, because Iran is an important part of Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Iran is an important player in the BRICS. And Iran is one of the countries that promote the idea of a multipolar world. So for Russia, it's a very serious problem. But in the meantime, Russia is also very careful not to alienate Israel completely, because we have very good chemistry between the leadership. And in the previous decade, for example, Israel was one of the major Russian partners in the Middle East, at least in the economic domain. So it's a very difficult balancing game that Russia is trying to play, and Russia is sincerely trying to achieve some kind of a political solution.
All right, but Barin, what about Turkey? A NATO member, of course. Iran and Turkey have long viewed each other's activities with suspicion. Their relationship has been marked by cycles of competition and cooperation. Will this support, this tacit support that Turkey has given, at least verbally, evolve beyond anything more than words and back-channel diplomatic support for its neighbor?
I very much doubt that, Andrew. First of all, thank you for having me on the program. I very much doubt that Turkey will give any material support, especially of the military variant, to Iran. At best, in my analyses and reports, both for public consumption and more confidential sorts for clients and whatnot, I always use the word frenemy for Turkey and Iran, a portmanteau term for the combined friend and enemy. On the one hand, they are close trading partners. In the past, before the massive sanctions on Iran's hydrocarbon industry, Turkey was a very good customer of Iran's oil and gas industries, and would sell a lot of goods and services to Iran. And Iranian tourists are often among the top 5 visitors to Turkey, because they don't need a visa to visit here. On the other hand, these two countries have been very serious competitors, geopolitical competitors in the region, especially in Iraq, but especially in Syria. And since the fall of the Assad regime back in December, there has been some coldness, if you will, between Ankara and Tehran. Tehran, of course, is very upset for having lost one of its key critical allies / proxies in the region. And of course, Turkey, the Erdogan government, is in a very good place for having allowed one of its clients, one of its proxies in Syria, to have taken over Syria. That's not to say that Turkey is gloating about Iran's woes in any way, shape, or form. As earlier in the report, President Erdogan's tweets made it very clear that Turkey is very vehemently opposed to Israel's action, and there is a concern that, given Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's statements in the past, the Israeli government may be opting not only to degrade Iran's nuclear program, but to catalyze, if you will, a regime change, a massive regime change, possibly a violent one within Iran itself, which is completely against Turkish interests.
Glenn, I'll get your thoughts on both Russia and Turkey in just a moment. But first, to what extent does China stand to be this conflict's biggest geopolitical loser? Has Iran somehow served as a vehicle for China's foreign policy in the Middle East region? What would it mean for China if there was regime change in Tehran?
Yeah, well, at present, China, and in particular, is shaping up to be the big loser in the changes occurring here. China's interests are to have access to low-cost fossil fuels, petroleum, and strategically to strengthen the anti-Western or alternative to Western norms, the normative international system, in favor of a sphere of influence one where China, Russia, the United States, respectively, and other powers have more influence instead of deferring to or trying to adhere to the supposed post-war norms. So in that sense, what's happening is not good for China or Russia strategically, although if oil prices go up, then in a more immediate sense, it's a challenge for them also.
All right. Nikolai, I just wanted, picking up on what you were saying earlier on about the doves and the hawks in Moscow right now, it's the pragmatists that are possibly coming out on top. Iran, of course, provided Russia with weapons for its war in Ukraine. Do you foresee circumstances in which Russia would do the same for Iran? Or would Russia really abandon Iran to stand on its own? That the wide-ranging treaty that the two countries signed at the beginning of the year, didn't include any sort of military alliance or impose any obligations on either side. Is Iran just too politically inconvenient at the moment for Russia, isolated as it still is from the West?
Well, I would say that there are no military obligations, as far as I know, under the treaty. But this treaty was supposed to really expand strategic partnership. When I speak about strategic partnership, I mean deeper economic ties, much greater trade volume, and etc., including cultural ties. Because Russia-Iran relations were always unbalanced. We had a serious political cooperation, but there were problems in the economic domain. Now we were trying to balance that. But if you speak about Russia's attitude at the moment, as you can see, Russia was trying to improve relations with the West, especially with the US. And Russia never wanted to undermine its relations with Israel. Even, after Israel transferred Patriot systems to the Ukraine, Russia was very careful not to criticize it very intensively. So now I believe that Russia will not provide immediate military support to Iran. But in the future, when the war is over, and if this government remains at power, Russia will definitely participate in the reconstruction economically, and Russia might provide some assistance to the Iranians in terms of rebuilding their military potential as well. Some Russian MPs were already mentioning supplies of air defenses, but it will not be an immediate support anyhow. Because right now Russia is trying to find some political solutions, as I said previously.
Barin, what threats and opportunities does this conflict present for Turkish foreign policy? Would Turkey perhaps seize the opportunity, if there is regime change in Iran, or if the conflict escalates, to become the regional player, supposing that Iran completely loses its current leverage within the region?
Absolutely. Although, while that might appear as an opportunity for Ankara in the short term, that might appear to be so in its foreign policy, especially in the last 6-7 years. Bracketing Syria, with the exception of Syria, Turkish foreign policy has been rather conservative, I would say. And in general, Turkey has always been very, very skeptical about the notion of forceful regime change in its backyard from abroad. Since the rise of the Arab Spring in 2011, we have witnessed this on multiple occasions. And going back to 2003 with the U.S. occupation of Iraq, any forceful regime change, especially that from abroad in Iraq and Syria and Libya, has always posed a geopolitical risk for Turkey. So there might be some opportunities in the immediate run, but if there is a regime collapse in Iran and there is an extended period of tumult in Iran, and we face this sort of undocumented immigration of the similar to the one we saw in Syria during the course of that country's 14-year civil war, then that would be a much bigger problem for Turkey. My sense is that, and my reading and my conversations here in Ankara, to me, show that there's much skepticism about the notion of regime change and in Iran. And as far as the Turkish government is concerned, the two sides would rather, and the United States and Russia and hopefully China would rather put a lid on this.
Glenn, to what extent has Israel's action forced Russia, China, and Turkey together?
Well, it does push them closer together. I mean, they are allies of more than convenience, but essentially because they oppose what they characterize as U.S. hegemony and the Western normative system, which they find constraining and intrusive in their domestic affairs and, for that matter, their foreign policy affairs. So Israel's attack on Iran has just strengthened what are the reasons for their friendship already. Now, I think both of our colleagues have made good points that neither country, Russia nor China, has an interest in overtly and strongly taking actions by providing weapons or any other action to Iran. Their interests are in being more subtle, and which is what they are, trying diplomatically to decry and to stop destabilization, which war always brings, or regime change. Whereas regime change, I think, really is, from the Israeli strategic perspective, and arguably from the American one, the only solution long term to the problem of Iran. Destroying facilities, as Israel has been doing, buys immediate and medium-term improvement from Israel's perspective, but doesn't change the nature of the strategic challenge or objectives of the Iranian regime. Now, whether that will happen and whether that would bring catastrophe, we don't know, but a change of regime is always an alarming situation because no one can really manage that kind of thing very well.
Glenn, to what extent has Israel's actions played into the Iranian leadership's hands?
Oh, I don't think at all. The Iranian regime is in a tight spot. There are surrogates, which Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthi even in Iraq and Syria, in Gaza, have been seriously weakened in the last 2 years. The Iranian military conventionally is not capable of striking in a meaningful way Israel. They have missiles, which have been shown to be less effective so far than most had feared, although they can still strike and cause damage. So, and they don't have, they have the hostility of a vast majority of the Iranian population. So that gives them the IRGC and the people who control the weapons in Iran, buttressing the regime. They're in a tough spot. They can't do a lot, and their one remaining option is to become a nuclear weapons possessor, which is, nuclear weapons are viewed by many as the inoculation against invasion or regime change, because no one wishes to wrestle with a nuclear state. The stakes are so high. However, Iran doesn't have the weapon yet, which is why Israel is acting, and why India was constrained in its conflict with Pakistan recently. that's their one choice, one option now, the one card they have to play, which they are quite subtle themselves and intelligent and realize the risks. To do that may well bring actions by the United States and even more by Israel for regime change, and not to do it has put them in a far weakened position. So they don't have a lot of ways forward that are positive for them being the Iranian regime.
Nikolai, what role could Russia play in facilitating a de-escalation of this conflict? Of the major global powers, to what extent is Moscow best placed to do that?
Well, Moscow and Beijing are the two great powers that are viewed by the Iranian leadership as at least friendly states, and that they might play, well, either an intermediary role or to provide some guarantees if there is some kind of an agreement. These are the two things that are quite essential under the current circumstances. And also, I believe that if there is an agreement, Russia and China will be the key players in rebuilding the Iranian economy, because we need to remember that the Israelis are now actually striking energy industry in Iran. And this might be quite damaging, because Iran was already suffering. And believe me, the real threat to this current government will come after the conflict, when they will have to struggle the economic damage caused by the Israeli strikes. And that will be the major issue. And only after that we will see whether this government will survive or not. But in the meantime, well, Israel and the U.S. are key players, and we could see that the U.S. was providing ammunition to the Israelis, and they have plenty of it. And I think that Israelis will not stop until they decide that Iran is not a source of danger. And until that moment, we will not see any progress on the diplomatic side of this crisis.
Okay.
But after we see real negotiations, then perhaps major powers could do some, could provide some help, but not before that. We can see, from the Russian perspective, we can see that both sides of the conflict are still willing to continue the fight. No one's prepared to stop it at the moment.
All right, but Barin, the question that I put to Glenn a few minutes ago, when I said, to what extent has Israel played into the regime's hands in Iran, the government's hands there? I was hoping he might have said, well, they could quickly come to the table, agree a nuclear deal, save themselves and save their nuclear program. Where did Turkey stand on Iran's nuclear ambitions, given its dual relationships with both the US as a NATO ally and, of course, Iran, its regional neighbor and trading partner?
For Turkey, Iran's nuclear program at this moment does not pose an existential threat. If Iran were to weaponize its nuclear program, however, then that would change the game, and it might, down the road, force Turkey to consider developing nuclear weapons. There is vehement opposition within Ankara, however, that of becoming a pariah state in world affairs of the sort that Iran is going through right now, and North Korea has become further, and the way that Pakistan has faced massive international sanctions. So there's a lot of opposition to that notion of Turkey developing its own nuclear weapons. So far, Turkey has, since the negotiations in the Obama years, have started and then resulted in the nuclear deal of 2015, which President Trump then got out of in 2018. There's been support to go back to that, to a version of that deal where Iran agrees to inspections, pledges that it will not try to weaponize its nuclear program. It will not enrich uranium beyond a certain point, and would allow inspections to continue. That's more or less the Turkish position, Andrew.
Okay. Glenn, we talked earlier about perhaps China being the biggest geopolitical loser in this conflict. None of what's happening right now will have come as any surprise to China. it's bound to have made contingency plans for this situation, right? You'd think so. It has considerable military power. If this conflict does widen, would the current tension, do you think, force it to project at least some of that in the region, at least to preserve its huge economic and trade interests here?
I don't think so. Its primary interests are really about low-cost energy supplies, and it's, I think, by far the largest purchaser of Iranian petroleum. I don't think that China has never shown the interest or inclination in projecting its military power in the way you describe, which is more how the Americans have done it for decades, and Russia more recently has been doing it that way. But they will certainly try to stop, I think, regime change and such destruction that Iran's capabilities in the petroleum sector would be seriously damaged and world prices would rise. Beyond that, China, I don't think, is likely to do too much because the costs diplomatically, economically, strategically for China, or the uncertainties at least, of projecting power by starting to become an overt provider of weapons and military support to Iran in this crisis would provide benefits to China, really. I see that as not likely at present.
Gentlemen, there we must end it. Many thanks indeed. Barin, Kayaoglu, Glenn Carle and Nikolai Sukhov. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. You'll find that at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finigan, and the team here in Doha, we'll see you again. Bye for now.